田大善人的这个豪爽大手笔。那么接下来还有华尔街联报呢，在华尔街联报中，我们也会给大家分享什么事情啊是让习近平寝食难安。那么在周末之后呢，还有这个华尔街论坛的周末版，那不要错过周末的节目。那这个常规的华尔街论坛呢，就要在过完周末之后再和大家不见不散了。
各位观众，大家好，阎淮先生您好，
法林好，大家好。
我们这一期节目就接着上一期节目来。上一期节目呢，我们就介绍了您出版了一本新书，还是在明镜出版社出版了一本新书。这个对于明镜来讲的话，也是非常破例的，因为明镜出版社呢，好像我的印象当中，就是2019年、2020年之后啊，当然也是因为疫情，就没有再出过新书了。那么这一次呢，您就这本书呢，就算是明镜又为您破例出版这本新书。也可能我说错了，因为后来我退休了，有些情况也不是那么了解了。但是呢，我们上次讲了，你这本新书的书名就是《进出新加坡监狱》。我们当然主要是要讲这个问题啊。我想我们的观众啊，也肯定是急着听你的下文，到底怎么会因为间谍罪进了新加坡的监狱？但是讲这个问题之前呢，我想还是请大家稍安勿躁，还是先请您讲一讲啊，过五关斩六将的这个人生经历。因为这个我们估计有些观众他看了你前那个2017年那本书，有的观众可能没有看，或者说还没来得及看。那么还是先从这个您的上一本书啊讲起，从您的这个人生经历讲起。这个从哪儿讲呢？我建议啊，就是从您这个《进出中组部》这本书啊，它封面上的2句话，
好，
生发开来。这2句话，我想我再给大家念一下啊，就是祖国44年，从革命之子到反对政暴，海外28载，从民运骨干到政治学人。这个呢，非常高度概括了您这个72年。
72年，
那么是不是从这儿讲起？
好，现在可以开始了吗？
开始啊，请讲。
好，对吧？因为我这是进出新加坡的秘密监狱啊，这个到时候一个什么货色能够进出这个监狱呢？我就讲讲我这个情况。我1945年呢，出生在江苏淮安，沿淮嘛，啊，当时这个父母是新四军的干部，10月份嘛，这个日本刚投降啊，共产党和国民党都这个争东北地盘，我就跟着父母到了东北，到东北之后呢，这个父亲当县委书记啊、市委书记啊，随着共产党的这个胜利，地盘大，这个他们也进步了啊。最后到了这个黑龙江的省委的工业部，我也呢就在干子弟的这个幼儿园呐、小学呀，1955年呢，我的父亲调在了长春第一汽车制造厂啊，在那做安安公司的经理，就这认识了江泽民。江泽民当时是这个汽车厂的动力车间的这个叫动力，后来叫动力分厂也好的副厂长或动力处的副处长。我父亲管安装，他管接收，所以关系比较密切了。当时2个人配合很好，我书也写了。这江泽民是一个大知识分子的书记干部，跟我父亲也是一个对吧中知识分子的局级干部，在工作配合很好啊，因此呢2家成好朋友了。以后的这个半个多世纪没再共事，但是一直是好朋友。不管因为写个伏笔嘛，我的后来的经历跟江泽民有些关系，然后汽车厂建成之后，我父亲调到北京啊，这个第一届工业部，然后我呢就开始这个对吧上学嘛，到北京上中学了，就北京101中，也是干部子弟学校，对吧？像毛远新呐，这个郑应红啊，都是学校出来的。然后64年呢，就进了清华大学，清华大学的工程物理系，当时是搞核物理的，学2年嘛，到65年文化革命了。文化革命中， 啊，我们就这些人就离开了系的范围的全校活动了。我呢就成了这个清华红卫兵的总部委员，我们公务系呢这个红卫兵第一把手，对吧？这个老红卫兵嘛，也干了不少坏事儿。但是过程中呢，我就认识了陈元，陈云的儿子陈元，宋国荒的儿子，sorry，宋任生的儿子宋国荒。我们3个人在1967年的1月份写大字报炮轰中央文革，后来就被打成反革命了。反革命之后嘛，我们3个人大概都表现不错吧，所以呢，我们就成了莫逆之交了，对吧？困难时也没有互相，对吧？尤其他们2个人分级比较高了，我这分地位比较低点，但是，对吧？好像我容易攻破的，我也没有揭发，没有落井下石，所以在文化革命之后呢，当时陈云提出在中组部成立青年干部局，对吧？这个组织部很重要了。共产党一成立就是有组织和宣传2个方面，对吧？李达是负责宣传，啊，张国焘负责组织，啊，历来这个组织部，你看组织部的像彭真呐，这个陈云呐，都当过组织部长的，他就提出在中组部成立青年干部局，组织部一直有，但是青年干部局是第一次出现，就要当时提出培养第3梯队，就是后备干部。因此陈云呢，就办公室，当然陈云把他的老的曾经当过他秘书，也当过毛泽东的这个通讯秘书的李锐，指定为青干局的局长。然后陈云办公室给李锐这11个人名单，说你好好调查了解啊，哪个合适就要哪个，但是第一个严怀不要调查，必须要。当然李锐还有看法，我到中央组织部。因此我这本书嘛，原来的那本书的副标题是一个理想主义者的红二代的另类人生，15个字，对吧？当时您和这个和平这个题目不好，太长了啊，就改成这个进入中组部啊。我当时多说一句，历来不屑于这个标题党，但是这个市场就是我还是听专业人士，所以这本书这个名字确实，尽管我在中组部4年，后来在就研究所2年，这是6年，确实是啊，也是人生在国内我的辉煌的时候，也是他们大家评论这本书的干货的最主要的地方。在中央组织部呢待了4年，就是考察第3梯队，先后考察了这个，就是前2天跟和平也谈这个问题，胡锦涛、习近平啊，其他比如什么这个李长春呐、李铁英啊、张德江啊，这一干人物吧，这个都考察过，这几年。然后呢，82年到86年，86年之后提出要政治改革啊，特意等于说为我成立一个北京组织人事研究所，这个所的名义是归北京管，但没有北京市字儿，一个就是北京为全国的服务。在这里做2年，我们对全国干部制度改革做了些工作。最后我们的工作就被赵紫阳在13大的报告中的第4部分，赵紫阳第13大报告就是政治改革嘛，第4部分关于干部人事制度改革，就是由我们起草的这个方案压缩之后放的。然后这个88年，我看改革也差不多了。我在工厂做过，研究所做过，啊，国务院机关做过，党员机关做过。是不是想到公司去？正好当时，对吧？成立了康化公司，对吧？就是实际上邓小平的大公子邓卜方的这个后台也好啊。当时我在那个公司里一个最主要的公司叫荣森公司啊，当时康华各公司都是免税，把这个利润交给残疾人基金会，发展中国的残疾人事业。我们这公司呢，把所有的利润呢，就养那个总公司的几百人，他们开工资啊，过年过节过去还得分点礼物啊什么的，干这事情。因此呢，我们是最主要的公司，你的好项目在这儿。当时跟韩国民建交，对韩贸易归我们管，对台贸易也归我们管。在我在的时候呢，就成立一个跟台商成立一个公司。当时在这个89年的时候啊，我们那个公司每年开启董事会，89年 在夏天应该在香港还开董事会，但是不能去台湾了嘛。因此在六四等过程呢，我有看法，但是我明白，对吧？4、5试验，第一个天面试验我参加了，第二个我不会参加的，不会在，甚至又是康华的这个公司头头，这不适合在天安，所以没有任何问题。6次以后又经过2次的政治审查，到香港开会。当时再有一句话，63年晚上6次早上，我在天安门广场，在我身边就倒下几十个人，我不说都死了，倒下几十人，是吧？我没经过什么战争场面，但是那天晚上肠子断了什么的，我觉得那几天睡不好觉。第二天我到复兴医院一查，42个尸体，对吧？当时儿童医院都多少尸体，那天受不了了。我觉得，假如文革的时候，我觉得对党对毛泽东错误，我觉得要救这个党。1980年6月4号那天，我觉得这个党不可救了。前面提到我们家跟江泽民关系非常密切。我只讲一个事情就说明密到什么程度了。大概1989年6月24号晚上7点半，联播节目一结束，联播节目宣布党的13届大概4中全会开了，到党解除职务，由江泽民同志任党总书记。这个7点半新闻联播一结束，我们家电话响了，因为当时6次以后，我父母心情不好，他们都搞学生运动，我就在家里陪着父母。电话响了，我一电话，熟悉声音啊，小严呢？他挺熟悉嘛，叫你爸接电话。我小声说江叔叔电话，江泽民又来电话了。
对不起，您稍微讲慢一点，这个地方呢，就是你们讲的比较快，可能我怕我们的观众听不清楚。
好，
就说您就是6月1989
年
6月
号晚上
结束之后，马上就响起铃声，一听呢就叔叔的声音，江泽民的声音，是吧？
对，
他听见是你，就是说小严叫你爸接电话。
对，然后我爸接电话之后就说：“老严呢，这次不好意思没有看你去，我身不由己了。”我当时江泽民也当政局委员、上海市委书记的时候，每次到北京开会，因为政局是2个月开一次会的例会，并且经常汇报工作。每次来之后，就到家里看我父亲，或者我父亲在医院的时候，就到医院看我父亲。当时新四军老干部都讲，你看江泽民都是政局委员了，国家领导人了，还看老严这个过了气儿的一个算副级干部吧。确实那个跟我们关系不错，同时呢，就在那个新军老人对江泽民影响也很好。因为地位差很多了，尽管半个世纪前我父亲是上级，他是下级，但是对不对？那现在到这时候他是政局委员了，我叫副国级了，我父亲还是这个副部级，对吧？干部这种干部在北京如毛嘛。所以当时情况就讲这情况了让同事问我母亲好，我父亲说你担任更重要的职务了，对吧？希望你对吧？这个为党为国家做更大的贡献嘛。同时问叶平好，就问他太太好嘛。就是情况就是这情况。当时我还蛮肚子气的，是吧？他这个水平真高，早1分钟算泄露国家机密没公布嘛，晚1分钟就怠慢老同志了我是当时说呢，这水平李鹏下辈子学不会，因为李鹏当时跟学生对话，对吧？结结巴巴的，我说呢，对吧？耀邦子阳是不学一学这个，因为当初6次有气嘛，就这情况。7月份我就到了香港开会，到香港之后，我就把7月份党费交了，把从北京到香港机票钱退回去了，然后我到法国参加民主运动了。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的华尔街争议节目。今天我们将深入探讨一个引发广泛关注的话题：中共党校博士周天勇的文章竟然在网络上被全网删除。文章中他大声疾呼，要求立即停止地方政府以滞留民营企业家的方式来补充财政收入，这不仅是对企业家的打击，更是对国民经济的潜在灾难。周天勇指出，地方政府因为财政困难，将目光投向了当的企业，甚至利用纪检机构对企业家进行滞留，迫使他们交钱以换取自由。这样的做法不仅会破坏企业的正常运营，还将导致大规模的经济崩溃。 随着企业家被滞留，企业面临资金链断裂、股价下跌、订单减少等一系列问题，最终可能导致无数企业关闭或转移资产，让已经疲惫不堪的国民经济雪上加霜。如果这一不当现象不加以制止，地方政府将继续用这种简单粗暴的方式来解决财政问题，国家的促进政策将变得毫无意义。这究竟是怎么一回事？我们将一起深入分析这一事件的背后，揭示更深层的问题。请大家继续收看详细内容。周天勇作为一名著名的中共党校博士，近日在一篇引发广泛关注的文章中发出了警示，呼吁紧急停止地方政府通过扣押民营企业家来补充财政收入的做法。然而，这篇文章在全网迅速被删除，引发了更大的社会反响。周天勇的观点之所以引发争议，是因为他揭示了一个触及社会敏感神经的问题。地方政府和纪检部门在财政压力和债务负担下，不得不采取非常规手段来填补财政缺口。地方各级党委不仅向党政司法各机构分派了财政任务，还通过纪检部门采取拘留企业家并要求巨额赎金的方式来创收。这种做法导致了恶劣的经济后果，不仅严重扰乱了本地企业的正常运营，还大大损害了民营企业家的信心。例如，某地方纪检部门在一次抓捕行动中拘留了一位本地骨干企业的老板。据知情人士透露，该企业家被指控涉嫌行贿，而事实上证据薄弱。拘留期间，银行和其他债权人迅速逼债，导致企业股价暴跌、订单锐减、员工士气低落，企业面临倒闭威胁。即使企业家最终被释放，他也不再信任本地环境，开始谋划将资产转移到国外。这一系列连锁反应不仅导致该企业元气大伤，还引发了行业内的恐慌。周天勇指出，这种通过纪检部门拘留企业家以获取财政收入的做法，无异于饮鸩止渴。一旦蔓延开来，骨干民营企业纷纷倒闭、停业、关闭、出走，国家发改委出台再多的促进民企发展政策，财政部搞再多的赤字，人民银行放再多的货币，降再多的息，也无济于事，国民经济的复苏将变得遥不可及。当年农业部、资源部、住建部兴起的大规模对大中小微企业拆围运动，3年疫情封街封门封企业运动，毁企业、缩就业、减收入、伪消费，后果已经使国民经济如此疲惫不堪。他说，在另一篇媒体报道中，一位不愿透露姓名的企业家分享了他的亲身经历。他的公司在当地是行业龙头，但由于财政压力，当地政府不仅对企业进行各种名目的罚款，还通过纪检部门的手段将其拘留，并要求支付高额的保释金才能获释。这位企业家无奈地说，我们不是不愿意配合政府，但这种方式太极端，根本无法让企业安心经营。这些实例并非个例，周天勇的文章中也提到，某些地方政府以纪检为工具，通过滞留企业家的办法获取财政收入的现象，已经在一些地区蔓延开来。这种行为表面上似乎解决了短期财政问题，但实际上对长远的国民经济造成了重大损害。企业一旦对本地环境失去信心，资本外逃、经济萎靡、失业率上升、社会矛盾激化等问题将接踵而至。众多媒体和学者也对此现象表示了担忧。经济观察报在一篇评论文章中指出，用这种极端方式获取财政收入，不仅违反了市场经济的基本原则，还严重损害了民营企业家的合法权益。南方都市报的一篇社论则更为直言不讳地批评这种行为是行政强权下的经济掠夺。为了防止这一现象进一步恶化，周天勇提出了几点建议。他呼吁，首先，地方各级党委政府应尽快停止通过纪检部门拘留企业家来创收的做法。其次，中央政府应加大对地方财政支持力度，特别是在当前经济下行压力大的背景下，帮助地方政府缓解财政困难。最后，各地应加强市场环境的建设，保障企业家的合法权益，恢复企业对本地环境的信心。尽管周天勇的文章被全网删除，但其引发的讨论和关注并未停止。许多学者和媒体纷纷呼吁，应该正视这一问题，采取有效措施来遏制这种极端行为。只有在一个法治健全、市场环境良好的条件下，民营企业才能真正安心发展，国民经济才能稳步复苏。在当前全球经济形势不乐观的背景下，中国的经济增长面临诸多挑战。如果地方政府为了短期利益而采取极端手段，必然会对整体经济造成严重伤害。 周天勇的呼吁正是希望能够唤醒更多人对这一问题的关注，推动政府采取更为科学合理的措施来解决财政困难，确保国民经济的健康发展。由此可见，周天勇的文章尽管被删除，但其所揭示的问题和提出的建议依然具有重要的现实意义。希望通过社会各界的共同努力，能够找到切实可行的解决方案，保障民营企业的健康发展，推动国民经济的稳步复苏。这不仅是对企业家的保护，更是对整个国家经济未来的负责。近年来，司法机关意地抓捕民营企业主，查封外地企业财产，这种现象在法律界被称为远洋捕捞式办案。这背后的原因和地方财政困境息息相关。3月12日，红泛法律与经济研究所举办了一场题为“财政困境和趋利性执法”的研讨会。与会人士指出，地方财政困难导致了趋利性执法增多，通过罚没收入来补充地方财政。红泛法律与经济研究所所长王勇表示，土地财政难以为继，地方财政面临巨大压力，在这种情况下，罚没收入归地方所有，这对地方司法机关进行远洋捕捞式办案形成了诱导。这种情况就像是一场地方政府之间的互相厮杀，可能会造成全局性的灾难。在刚刚结束的2024年全国两会上，保护民营经济再次成为热门议题。从最高法院、最高检察院工作报告到众多的议案、提案、建议，都强调要建设法治化营商环境，保护民营企业和民营企业家。然而，北京金门律师事务所的朱明勇律师指出，虽然政策层面提倡保护民营企业，但刑事司法实践中却屡屡出现民营企业遭受打击的乱象，必须警惕远洋捕捞式逐利性办案，防止中央精神在刑事司法实践中被异化。北京理工大学法学教授徐新通过现实案例对趋利性执法现象进行了分析。他总结说，目前趋利执法的类型主要分为不还钱和创收钱两种。所谓不还钱，即政府欠钱却不想还，而创收钱则是通过执法来创收。徐新表示，远洋捕捞式执法属于创收钱的一种方式，又可分为常态型和政策型。常态型体现在年终冲业绩，每年底特定类型案件数量会大幅增加，而政策型执法则体现为政策影响区域性执法数量，比如各种专项行动等。办案需要成本，有些地方公检法会进行筛选，远洋捕捞的案子通常涉案金额大，涉案方财产多。徐新认为，原因在于办案单位可能通过案款提留获得奖励，办案人员也能获得升职等激励。朱明勇总结了远洋捕捞式办案的特点。他说，部分地区的司法机关不打籍本的名气，专打外的名气。这些司法机关共同的特点是所在地区经济较为发达，办案人员专业水平较高，案件涉及一些技术含量较高的新兴领域。办案人员发现网络上哪些外地企业行为有可能违规，甚至经营活动有瑕疵，便提前部署。这些司法机关办案不叫办案，而是叫经营案件。为了进一步获取涉案企业的罪证，有的是钓鱼执法，有的是碰瓷式执法，有的甚至找人冒充被害人。朱明勇说，个别公安机关专门瞄准有钱的民营企业，不惜花费大量警力去侦办。一旦形成思维惯性，侦查活动就不再是为了保障社会平稳运行的职权行为，而是变成了逐利性的经营行为。徐新和朱明勇都提到，这类案件通常涉及几亿甚至几十亿元的资金，都是一个地方的公安加另外一个地方的民营企业。朱明勇说，中央要求保护民企，但一些地方在变相打击民企，各省市之间交叉办案抓人。在某些官员看来，打击外地的民营企业不属于本地政府对民营企业保护力度不够，但这种另类的理解显然不符合中央政策的本意。即便当地政府对本的民企保护力度再大，如果外地公安机关把本地民企的人都抓走并定以重罪，各地都按照这种模式操作，民营企业如何能得到保护？徐新进一步分析说，目前诈骗、传销等成为趋利执法的重要罪名，这类案件中受害人比较分散，不会团结起来要求赔偿，趋利性执法得以实现。办理这类案件技巧很多，执法机关之间也会相互学习交流这种隐秘的经验，比如有些地方开展异地学习新型案件的办案技术等培训。 从市场角度来看，司法正义是全国人民都应该享有的公共产品，要避免地方保护主义影响司法正义。中国法学会财税法学研究会会长、北京大学法学院教授刘建文说，实践中的趋利性司法更多偏向对不正当利益的追求，体现的是国库中心主义、地方保护主义。在公权力主体与权利人地位不平等的背景下，追求不正当利益，主要是公权力主体的不正当。司法领域的体现是公权力使用不当，在财政领域体现的是地方职能部门直接追求不正当利益，这些在某种程度上又具有地方保护性质。宽泛的管辖制度也为远洋捕捞式执法提供了充足的动力和依据。朱明勇直言，公安机关立案管辖的范围不断扩张，在司法实践中几乎是沾边就管，什么都可以管。刑事诉讼法第25条确立的管辖原则是犯罪地和被告人居住地。2020年公安部公安机关办理刑事案件程序规定第16条将犯罪地解释为犯罪行为发生地，包括实施地、预备地、开始地、途径地、结束地和犯罪行为结果地，犯罪对象被侵害地、犯罪所得的实际取得地、藏匿地、转移地、使用地、销售地，被告人居住地解释为户籍所在地和经常居住地。2022年2高一部关于办理信息网络犯罪案件适用刑事诉讼程序若干问题的意见，将信息网络犯罪案件的犯罪地进一步解释为用于实施犯罪行为的网络服务使用的服务器所在地、网络服务提供者所在地。被侵害的信息网络系统及其管理者所在地，犯罪过程中犯罪嫌疑人、被害人或者其他涉案人员使用的信息网络系统所在地，被害人被侵害时所在地，以及被害人财产遭受损失地等。朱明勇说，现今不论是企业的生产经营活动，还是个人的工作生活，都离不开互联网。从制度规范层面来看，公安机关的立案管辖权几乎扩张到了任何一个角落，这使得远洋捕捞有了合理的法律依据。管辖规定给公安机关提供依据，公安机关在目之所及的范围内寻找谁有钱，哪儿的民营企业可以抓。答案是民营企业有钱，外地的民营企业可以抓，乱象便由此产生。此外，财政困境也是导致远洋捕捞式办案的原因之一。近年来，部分省份经济下行压力加大，地方财政紧张，刑事案件的罚没收入客观上缓解了地方财政压力。财政部罚没财务管理办法第27条规定，罚没收入应按照执法机关的财务隶属关系缴入同级国库。第30条规定，执法机关的办案经费由本级政府预算统筹保障。朱明勇认为，在刑事司法实践中，一些公安机关与同级政府之间形成了利益绑定关系，政府需要公安的罚没款充实地方财政，而公安需要政府提供更多的办案经费作为资金保障，甚至在个别地区出现了更加极端的情况，同级公务员的工资等基本支出都依赖于公安办案收缴的罚没款，这导致公安对远洋捕捞式办案产生强烈的冲动。朱明勇说，从经济发展角度来看，远洋捕捞是逐利性执法，看似在短时间内缓解了地方财政的压力，但此举无异于杀鸡取卵。如果不制止这种现象，会对中国的民营企业造成致命打击。从社会治理角度来看，愈演愈烈的跨省抓捕会加剧地区之间的矛盾，冲击国家行政管理体制。因此，合理分配罚没收入迫在眉睫。当办案机关无利可图，自然会降低逐利性执法的冲动。具体方法有二：第一，地方的罚没所得统一上缴中央财政，由中央财政统一分配；第二，在不改变法律和司法解释的情况下，采用收支两条线的方式，本地公安机关可以对外地的民营企业案件有管辖权，办案支出由办案机关承担，但罚没收入由企业所在地的法院依法收缴。刘建文分析了财政困境的现状。在他看来，国家对地方政府性债务的关注始于2010年。2024年政府工作报告指出，从国内来看，经历3年的新冠疫情冲击，经济恢复发展本身有不少难题，长期积累的深层次矛盾加速显现，很多问题接踵而至，一些地方的房地产、地方债务、中小金融机构等风险隐患凸显。这表明了债务问题财政困局解决的急迫性，可以看到财政的确有困难。刘建文称，财政困境的表现多样。首先是财政自给率，尤其是地方财政自给率严重不足，并且这一现象已经不限于经济不发达或者人口压力较大的地区，呈现出蔓延的趋势。 其次，地方财政过度依赖土地出让金收入，不可持续的风险巨大。从公开数据来看，2007年到2018年，中国土地出让金收益从285亿增加到65096亿元，年复合增长率是22%，占财政收益的比重10.2%。此外，债务规模不断增长，中国的 GDP 在2008年至2018年的10年内增长了2.8倍，但债务总量却增长了10倍，并且仍然呈现增长态势。从债务来看，政府的资产远远超越了财政的承受能力，这使得要借新还旧等成为了地方政府偿债的重要手段。目前债务管理制度不完善。刘建文说，国家制定了预算法并几次修改，虽然在程序上明确了监管流程，但总体而言，对地方债务的监管过于原则，容易流于形式，监管可能没有真正发挥作用。此外，还有相当一部分隐性债务没有受到监督。政府、市场与社会的边界有待厘清，乡村振兴、老旧小区改造等都需要财政资金支持。中央的出发点是希望通过财政花钱激活市场资金，但达到这个目标需要进行好的财政管理。不过，现在许多财政工具的使用大部分是政府自行决策。在这种背景下，政府愈发强大，统包统揽，市场自治的空间就越小，市场资源配置机制的功效就难以有效发挥，最终容易造成体制机制的僵化，花钱越来越多，市场也疲软。如何改善财政困境？刘建文建议完善立法，加大向社会公开力度。各级政府往往只提供债余额、新增债务等总体数据，对于具体项目信息披露较少，缺乏详细资料和偿还计划等内容，地方人大及其常委会难以进行有效审查。要解决这些问题，需要从根本上改革财政制度，确保司法公正和财政透明。只有这样，才能从根本上杜绝远洋捕捞式办案，保障民营企业的合法权益，推动经济的健康发展。欢迎大家进入六度探索的辩论环节。我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
大家好，我是楚天舒。今天我们要讨论的是关于地方政府通过扣留民营企业家来补充财政收入的做法。这简直是现代版的抢劫，而且是合法化的抢劫。中共党校博士周天勇就这件事发声，呼吁紧急停止这种荒唐的做法。他的观点很明确，这种行为不仅破坏了企业家的信心，还严重威胁到国民经济的复苏。我们不能让地方政府为了填补自己的财政漏洞，把企业家当成人质。历史上，这种杀鸡取卵的行为从来没有好结果。比如清朝末年的苛捐杂税，就是把老百姓和商人逼上了绝路，最终导致了社会动荡和政权崩溃。
大家好，我是谢琪琪。楚天舒，你说的好像地方政府都成了大坏蛋，一心只想着抢钱。其实他们也是被逼无奈啊。地方财政困难，土地财政又不行了，怎么办？难道让公务员都不用吃饭了？再说了，这些企业家如果真的清白，又有什么好怕的？再说，历史上也有不少例子说明，严厉的执法有时候确实能起到震慑作用，比如明朝的张居正就靠严厉的税收改革，把腐败的财政状况扭转了过来。
谢琪琪，你这是典型的掩耳盗铃。张居正的税收改革是依法而行，而不是乱抓人，打击民营企业。你知道吗？最近的数据表明，许多骨干企业因为这种滞留手段，银行逼债，管理层和员工人心不稳，甚至面临倒闭。台湾经济日报报道，近年来，大陆因为这些原因已有超过10%的中小企业破产，这可不是个小数目。说到公务员吃饭，我们有其他方法，比如财政改革，提高税基，而不是靠这种远洋捕捞的手段。
楚天舒，你这也未免太理想主义了吧？财政改革？你以为说起来那么容易？地方政府已经穷得揭不开锅了，还搞什么财政改革？再说了，远洋捕捞也是为了增加地方财政收入，缓解当前的困境。你知道中国有多少地方政府的债务已经接近破产边缘吗？ 根据财政部的数据，截至2022年底，全国地方政府债务余额已经超过21万亿元人民币。这个时候如果不采取一些非常手段，难道坐以待毙？
谢琪琪，历史已经证明，短期的财政补救手段只会带来长期的灾难。日本在泡沫经济破裂后，政府通过增税和严刑峻法，结果是经济持续萎靡，至今还在失落的几十年中挣扎。我们需要长远的解决办法，比如中央财政支持，优化地方政府的债务结构，而不是靠这种见不得阳光的手段。企业家是经济的引擎，你把引擎都搞坏了，车还能跑吗？最后引用一句老话，欲速则不达。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的华尔街争议节目。今天我们将深入探讨一位中国亿万富翁如何在矽谷的奢华投资引起 FBI 的注意。5年前，山象双的私募股权公司 CSC 集团宣称要为中国引入外国高科技技术，并且透过 Home Capital 在美国发展业务。他们在近400家美国科技初创公司中建立了股份，这些公司涉及人工智慧、网络安全等关键技术。然而，这一切的繁荣却引起了美国当局的高度关注。FBI 正在调查 Home 是否将知识产权转移回中国，这可能对国家安全构成威胁。随着中美贸易紧张局势的加剧，这个话题引发了更多的担忧。Home Capital 的投资策略虽然迅速让它成为矽谷的活跃投资者，但其背后的复杂关系和潜在的法律纠纷却不容忽视。随着中国资本在美国科技领域的进一步渗透，矽谷的创业者们也开始重新评估接受中国资金的风险。更令人惊讶的是 ，Home 的高管之间的法律纠纷和对资金管理的指责，无疑为这场引人入胜的故事增添了更多戏剧性。从一个雄心勃勃的投资者到引发调查的焦点，这段旅程充满了挑战与争议。请大家继续收看详细内容。中国亿万富翁在矽谷撒钱，吸引了 FBI 的注意。5年前，山象双现 Zion Shuang 宣称他的100亿美元私募股权公司 CSC 集团正在打造一条直达矽谷的直通车，以加速外国高科技技术引入中国。这位亿万富翁投资者，中国共产党成员及前公务员，通过 CSC 在加州的投资工具 Home Capital 发展了在美国的业务。Home Capital 在约400家美国科技初创公司中投资，这些公司开发的技术涵盖人工智能、网络安全和超音速飞机等关键领域。然而，这一大规模的投资引起了美国当局的关注。金融时报披露 ，FBI 正在调查 Home 是否有知识产权被转移回中国公司或当局，从而引发潜在的国家安全问题。法庭文件、内部基金报告以及多名知情人士透露 ，Home 如何针对美国科技业，成为矽谷最活跃的早期投资者之一。这一崛起引起了美国官方的担忧，特别是在华盛顿与北京之间贸易紧张局势加剧的时刻。FBI 的调查重点集中在 Home 投资的拥有联邦政府合同的公司，特别是制药和生物技术领域。曾接受 Home 早期支持的一家初创公司的高管接受 FBI 访谈后表示，他们在很多企业伸展了触手。这位高管补充说，事后看来，接受中国基金的投资并不值得，因为吸引了美国当局的关注。Home Capital 于2015年成立，当时中国资金涌入美国科技界达到顶峰。面对国内股市崩盘，中国投资者当年向美国快速增长的初创公司投资了40亿美元，占2015至2017年期间美国风险投资公司外国资本总额的13%。中国投资者经常给他们的美国基金起西方名字，但背后通常集中来自主权、省、市政府以及国有企业、公司和个人。为了在矽谷站稳脚跟，山象双聘请了 Veronica Wu 这位在特斯拉、麦肯锡和苹果曾工作的前中国区员工来领导 CSC 的新业务。虽然他出生在北京，但受教育于美国，这让他成为了领导 CSC 矽谷业务的理想人选。同时 ，CSC 还聘请了美国初创企业家 Tom Cole 共同领导 Home 的业务。中国许多投资者在矽谷被称作傻钱，愿意花高价获得交易机会的外行。 然而 Hong 有一个雄心勃勃的计划来迅速获取信誉。2016年，他与当时最大的美国初创公司种子资本匹配平台 AngelList 建成合作。CSC 承诺投资4亿美元，建立了一个当时专注于早期初创公司的最大基金，这也是中国私募股权公司在美国基金中的最大单笔投资。这笔交易让 Hong Capital 拥有了 AngelList 平台上数千笔交易的优先购买权，并允许他在2015和2017年间进行更多投资，超过大多数风险投资家的一生。根据 Crunchbase 的数据 ，Hong 在2015年支持了74家公司，比当年任何其他种子投资者都多。到2017年 ，Hong 已经在约360家初创公司中投资了2.15亿美元。非常低调的，我们已经成为矽谷最活跃的投资者。吴在2016年接受 Quartz 访谈时表示 ，Hong 的投资并不限于科技领域，他还采取了一个不寻常的房地产策略，在美国各地购买了约743套独栋住宅，花费约1.4亿美元。但 Hong 早期投资的瑰宝是 Boom， 一家位于科罗拉多州的初创公司，致力于开发超音速客机。2017年的一份推介文件显示 ，Hong 帮助 Boom 的首席执行官 Blake Shaw 在中国建立了关系，并通过可转换票据投资约1000万美元，这在转换基础上代表了该初创公司总资本的不到1%。Boom 自此成长为一家价值数十亿美元的公司，拥有多个政府合同，包括与美国空军的合作及与 NASA 的研究项目。FBI 去年曾访问 Boom 的高管，询问是否有信息流向中国的风险。Boom 的一位知情人士表示，他们完全确信没有任何技术或财务信息从 Boom 传输出去。Hong 在2019年撤资，但少量股份转移至 CSC 集团在矽谷的另一支基金 CSC Upshot Ventures， 该基金仍然是 Boom 的投资者。然而，随着2018年特朗普政府对中国在美国知识产权的追求成为其总统任期内的一项主题，并签署了外国投资风险审查现代化法案 （FIRMA）， 加强对外国投资的审查，矽谷对中国的警惕也日益增强。同时 ，CSC 集团遇到了财务困难。根据法庭文件显示，中国证券监管机构对山象双及 CSC 进行了制裁，其公开子公司因证券法违规被从中国 NEQ 证券交易所退市。2019年，在帕洛阿托的3天会议中 ，CSC 集团的金融高管指示无出售Hong的大部分资产，以产生必要的资金来履行其财务义务。他们甚至没有满足 AngelList 的资金调用，最终仅提供了承诺4亿美元中的20%。这些举动引发了法律纠纷，涉及 CSC 和 Hong 的商业行为以及其高管的操守问题。Hong 起诉了吴及其前首席财务官 Fbi Gandhi， 指控他们共谋欺诈基金，以谋取个人利益并错误管理资金。反过来，吴和 Gandhi 否认这些指控，并起诉 Hong 和 CSC， 声称他们在表现激励方面做出了虚假承诺，并故意不支付欠他们的数百万美元的收益。Hong 和 CSC 否认他们欠任何款项。2名女性均于2020年离开 Hong。此外，吴的法律团队自2022年以来试图传唤山象双，他称自己受到中国的限制，无法履行。吴在法庭文件中指控 CSC 试图绕过美国和中国的法律，包括中国的外汇管制规定，并虚报一名高级中国高管常驻加州。他声称，收购公司的高管们，包括山象双，给了他一个配额，根据他能够将多少拥有关键知识产权的公司引入中国市场来评估他的绩效。吴表示，考虑到中国的知识产权保护问题和与中国共享敏感技术的法律问题，这是一个不可能完成的任务。即使在 Hong 工作期间，吴也曾发出过公开警告。创始人应该在了解利弊之前不要接受中国资金。他在2017年接受麦肯锡的访谈时说，中国投资者往往想拥有公司的一大部分，进入董事会，并对公司的决策有发言权。他在访谈中说，这对公司未必是好事，因为这可能会剧烈影响公司的方向，无论是好是坏。坚持保持自己自由是明智的。欢迎大家进入六度探索的辩论环节。我们从正反2个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
值得注意的是，山香霜的投资不仅加速了技术引进，还在一定程度上桥接了中美两国的科技合作。而那些对中资怀有偏见的人，或许应该反思一下，离开了中资的投资，美国多少初创企业将无法生存。
楚天舒，别忘了 FBI 的介入可是意味深长的，你知道吗？这些投资不仅可能带来技术转移的风险，还涉及到国家安全。你应该感谢 FBI 对我们的保护，他们可是现代版的神盾局啊。
Our study is the culmination of a 20-month investigation that relied on a mixture of qualitative and quantitative analysis. Qualitatively, we conducted deep roundtables with a number of experts in the fields across various advanced technology industries. We did deep dive case studies of 44 Chinese firms, looking at things such as their levels of R&D investment, how many R&D personnel they had, whether these companies had innovation teams inside the organization, what types of international awards they'd won in their fields, what market share do they have, and did assessments against global leaders in those fields. So here are the 10 industries we looked at: robotics, chemicals, nuclear, electric vehicles and batteries, machine tools, biopharmaceuticals, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and displays. So overall, we find that while the Chinese innovation system is not perfect, it is much stronger than was previously understood. And while the evidence suggests that China hasn't yet taken the overall lead, it has pulled ahead in certain areas. And then many other Chinese firms will likely equal or surpass Western firms within a decade or so. So specifically what we did for these 44 of companies in these 10 industries is look at their position vis-a-vis global leaders in their fields, and then kind of assess their pace of progress. And as you can see here, we find that on a 10-point scale, essentially where we had 1 being a firm being completely a copier with no real innovation, to 10, these companies being moderately to significantly ahead of the global leading edge, kind of 8 being at par, kind of at the leading edge, or 6 being lagging, but just by a couple of years, just with 2 years. We find that on this 10-point scale, it's really in nuclear and electric vehicles and batteries where Chinese firms and industries are doing the best. When we look at nuclear, for instance, China is currently deploying more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world combined. China has deployed more nuclear reactors in the past 10 years than the United States has in the past 30 years. They're going to surpass us in nuclear power generation by the year 2030. Also, in terms of innovation, China is the first country in the world to have operationally deployed 4th-generation nuclear reactors. These are ones with new designs, new passive safety systems. China is overall, according to an assessment from RPE, at least 10 years ahead of the United States in nuclear power. Electric vehicles and batteries. It's amazing to think that in the year 1985, China manufactured a grand total of 5,200 cars. This year, they're going to manufacture 26.8 million vehicles. That'll be 21% of global share. They're expected to hit 30% of global share by the end of this decade. And when we look at EVs particularly, China is now manufacturing 62% of the world's electric vehicles, 77% of the world's EV batteries. You can go down the list. I'll just pick out a couple others. I won't look at all of them. But biopharmaceuticals is an interesting one. We find there that China still lags American Western leaders, but they're rapidly catching up. In fact, the data shows that from 2002 to 2019, China's share of global value added in the biopharmaceutical industry increased 4-fold to nearly 25%. And just over the past 5 years, China's share of oncology drugs under development has tripled to nearly 20% of the global share. Robotics. Interestingly, with robotics, we found that the Chinese companies themselves weren't as innovative as their American, Korean, or Japanese peers, with the exception of KUKA now, which was bought, of course, from the Germans, and it is a Chinese firm now. So while the robotics firms themselves weren't as innovative, what was interesting was that China last year deployed more industrial robots than the rest of the world combined. And so this means that they're going to see the impacts of robotics and automation catalyzing across the rest of their manufacturing economy. Just to pick out one more, because I wrote it, semiconductors. Semiconductors was an interesting one because when you talk about semiconductors, you're really talking about 6 or 7 different industries within the semiconductor category, right? There's the manufacture of the logic chips versus the memory chips. There's the aftermarket assembly, test, and packaging. There's design, et cetera. So if you delve into my deep report on semiconductors, you'll see the sector-by-sector analysis. Overall, what we find is that in semiconductors, China is probably about 2 to 5 years behind global leaders. A recent teardown of a Huawei chip found them about 3 years behind. What's interesting, if you hear like Dan Hutchison, who runs a group called VLSI Research, he said a decade ago, China was about 3 to 4 years behind America in semiconductors. 5 years ago, it was that far behind. And today, it's still that far behind. This is why for semiconductors, we find that their position versus leaders is lagging and the rate of catch up is modest. I'm happy to take questions on the other ones. But overall, the report, our assessment finds that, as I said, Chinese firms and industries are far more innovative than we've generally given them credit for, and they're catching up rapidly, virtually across every advanced industry technology domain. Thank you. And with that introduction, I will turn it over to Emily and Rick for additional analysis. Either way, Emily, whatever.
Can y'all hear me? Okay, awesome. Thanks, Rob and Stephen and the rest of the ITIF team for this timely study and event. I'm excited to discuss China's innovation capacity with you today. As a China analyst at Daytona, companies specializing in China techno-economic open source intelligence, AI software services, I just have to begin by making clear that all my remarks today are just solely my own opinion, not those of Daytona. So it's a truism, perhaps, that innovation is a key driver of national power. Among nations aiming for tech dominance, China is particularly ambitious in its pursuit of technological leadership to secure its global position. As the ITIF study and report highlight, Chinese industries are either leaders or more frequently copiers and fast followers. The more I read these reports, the more I became fixated on a fundamental question: what exactly is innovation? While we often think about innovation as groundbreaking and disruptive technologies, China's innovation strength lies in its incremental upgrades and network effect across its vast industrial ecosystem, which is well positioned for steady technological advancement. This is the kind of innovation environment that is widespread across China, and the ITIF report does a fantastic job analyzing China's innovation model. To make sure I'm not just repeating the insights from ITIF's impressive report, my value add to today's conversation is that we walk through a thought experiment. If we were China's top leadership strategizing on technology security, what would Beijing's plan for leveraging innovation to fuel national strength be? How successful has China been in executing its tech security strategy? A key part of China's tech security strategy is outlined in the book, quote, The Total National Security Paradigm, a Study Outline, end quote. This is a book that was released in April 2022 by the CCP Central Propaganda Department and the Central National Security Commission. This is General Secretary Xi Jinping's formulation of a comprehensive national security strategy framework. In a chapter about technology security, Xi Jinping emphasizes that, quote, science and technology are the foundation of national strength and prosperity, and innovation is the soul of national progress, end quote. To protect this soul, China aims to become a leading tech power capable of countering strategic rivals. Official documents, such as this one, acknowledge that China lags in some technology areas. However, this book also noted that China is rapidly advancing and even leading in several cutting-edge fields. To turn technological leadership into economic growth and geopolitical power, Beijing has implemented policies like dual circulation, Made in China 2025, and the Document 79 from 2022, which aims to eliminate reliance on Western ICT technology in state-owned enterprises by 2027. By 2035, China plans to achieve technological supremacy through many of these targeted strategies. From reading this chapter on safeguarding China's tech security from this book, it seems that China's plan to achieve tech supremacy has 3 main prongs. The first prong is China wants to preserve and strengthen its existing advantages. China can leverage its deep manufacturing expertise, large and skilled labor force, dense supplier networks, and a systematic approach to industrial upgrading. For example, China is a global leader in electronics and renewable energy equipment. By continually improving production processes and keeping prices competitive, China has dominated these industries and is likely to maintain its lead. Additionally, advancements in industrial robotics, which combine AI-driven software and hardware, signal China's move toward the next phase of industrial innovation. The second prong of China's tech strategy is China wants to address its technological gaps. China is determined to overcome its technological shortcomings, such as those in the semiconductor industry, where it has long depended on foreign expertise and components. Strict export controls by the US, Japan, and the Netherlands have exposed China's vulnerability in this critical sector. In response, the Chinese Party state has ramped up efforts to develop a self-reliant semiconductor industry, investing heavily in domestic production and reducing dependence on foreign technology. However, challenges remain, such as restrictions on semiconductor equipment exports and maintenance from companies like ASML, which hinder China's ability to develop advanced nodes. Despite these obstacles, China continues to push for innovation to overcome these barriers. The third prong of China's technology security strategy is that China wants to secure a pioneering edge in emerging technologies. China aims to lead in emerging tech areas, one example being artificial intelligence. Unlike the United States, which excels in breakthrough AI developments like large language models, China leverages its vast access to data from its population to drive AI advancements. Chinese tech giants like Baidu, Alibaba, ByteDance, Tencent, and numerous research institutes are leading this push. Companies like SenseTime are not only advancing domestically, but also expanding internationally by helping authoritarian regimes develop AI-enabled smart cities and surveillance systems. This determination positions China to make significant strides and potentially rival major global players in the AI sector. There are 4 significant challenges that face China today that I will skip over because just in the interest of time, but just to go through them. The 4 awkward elephants in the room, if you will. First, it's uneven quality of human capital inside of China. Second is the tendency for inefficient capital allocation. The third is the drag from bureaucratic inefficiency and corruption. The fourth is China's challenging geopolitical environment. At the heart of China's strategy is the Chinese Party state's vision and political resolve. In a 2020 speech, Xi Jinping highlighted that the world is undergoing unprecedented changes and that scientific and technological innovation is key to navigating these shifts. Xi's confidence, saying, quote, "Time and momentum are on our side," end quote, reflects the party's readiness to endure significant hardships to achieve its long-term goals. Analysts like scholar Evan Medeiros suggest that the Chinese Party state's willingness to tackle deep-rooted structural issues, despite economic struggles, shows the party's commitment to long-term strength. This resilience and political resolve could enable China to move from quantitative growth to qualitative transformation, advancing its technological and geopolitical ambitions without major compromises. In conclusion, China's strategic integration of tech security into its national security framework, along with its 3-pronged approach to achieving tech primacy, shows its determination to secure a leading innovation position globally. Nevertheless, significant challenges, including uneven human capital development, inefficient capital allocation, bureaucratic inefficiency, and geopolitical tensions, pose substantial risks to the strategy's success. The Chinese Party state's vision and unwavering political resolve will be crucial in navigating these challenges. While China may be behind the United States on net innovative capacity currently, as assessed in the ITIF study and reports, its ideological environment is less contested than the one in the United States today. Specifically, the Chinese Party state's approach to industrial policy and technological upgrading is backed by an almost unified ideological fervor that the United States currently cannot match. The ITIF report calls for America to adopt certain elements of China's approach to technology policymaking and lays out many thoughtful policy proposals centered on a national security capitalism. Those proposals are more well thought out than anything I can conjure up. However, one thing I know for sure is that the outcome of China's technology security strategy, which is whether China can secure an innovation advantage and combine it with its existing scale advantage, will not only shape China's future, but also have profound implications for the global order, potentially redefining international power dynamics in the years to come. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate the report. I appreciate Rob having us here. I think the report points out some really important elements. I won't reproduce it. We don't have that much time anyway. I'd like to start with sort of a few myths and some megatrends. I think when we're sort of looking at China's innovation system, and I think the report does a very good job of pointing much of this out. It doesn't talk about this specifically, but this is something you hear in this building quite a lot, which is that China has stolen its way to being an innovator. While Chinese IPR theft is a massive problem, it is not a driver of China's innovation. China's IPR theft, to be frank, today is actually, from a strategic perspective, has greater impact as it relates to depriving U.S. firms of profits and market share that enables the U.S. innovation system to continue to drive innovation through churning profits back into research and development. Most of what China gets and most of what China has gotten in developing its innovation system has been done through legal means. The vast majority of China's sort of ability to move forward with really innovative companies was done through partnerships with foreign companies, through partnerships with foreign universities, with their students traveling abroad and bringing that technology back, either to be students or then working in major corporations. So the myth that where China finds itself today is something it stole its way into. And so therefore what we need is some sort of research security function is going to solve this problem is actually detrimental. There is a research security and research integrity aspect to this, but it's actually, the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the iceberg is 90% below. It's in the licit side, the cooperation that undertakes. And China can't be innovative. This is another myth you hear, that sure, they're good at copying and this would be illicit or licit, but are they really truly innovative? The CEO of Ford just came back from China, did an article about it just a couple of days ago. I spent time looking at the Chinese EVs, brought some back to his leading staff and said, this is the existential threat. Like, this isn't just a cheaper car. This is a more innovative car. It's providing, functionality and technology at scale in ways that consumers want that nobody in America is producing today. Right. And we see this in other industries. So that's a myth that folks need to get out of their mind. The PRC can innovate. They innovate all the time. They didn't steal their way there. They actually worked very hard to get there. But the mega trends that underlie this, I think, are where the interesting parts come, which is there's sort of two big mega trends going on right now. And both of them are part of this sort of Chimerica matrix, right? And Chimerica in the sort of science innovation, global sort of science innovation cluster is in full swing. It still exists. It has been very little restricted. It looks pretty close today that it did back in 2018. There have been some nibbling around the edges, but quite literally, our two science industrial complexes are almost completely intertwined. The United States' partner of choice for basic research is not Japan, it's not the United Kingdom, it's China. If you look at the number of papers that are jointly published with PRC nationals and PRC research institutions and U.S. researchers and research institutions, it's higher with the PRC than it is with any other single country. If you go and look at many of the top sort of basic science papers that underlie the technologies that these firms then turn into applied products and services, what you'll find is that the U.S. government is joint funding basic research with China's National Natural Science Foundation, with China's Academy of Sciences, with state key labs on things like quantum material science and others. And they're being joint funded by our Department of Energy, our Department of Defense, including the Armored Warfighter Program, and the National Science Foundation. So the United States and China are completely intertwined, but it is China that benefits most from this. So the mega trend here is that China continues to rely immensely upon its unfettered access to U.S. innovation in order to drive its innovation system. We built the largest, most important university, Tsinghua University. You can go back and look at the most important AI research center in China. Microsoft Research Asia was built by Microsoft. Tong Xiao'o, a graduate of Tsinghua University, an employee of Microsoft, went back and created the single most important AI cluster in China. You can track most of the leading AI cluster back to these transfers. There's another mega trend that's going on, again, where China is is looking at the United States as a model and sort of following it either by accident or by choice, which is today the vast majority of research in development in the United States takes place by 5 companies, right? The top 5 R&D companies provide more R&D as a percentage of national R&D spending than the U.S. government. The U.S. government spent about $190 billion in R&D. The top 5 companies, I'm sure you guys all know who they are. Time is short, I won't mention them. Over $210 billion. The same is true in China. You have the government, and then you have the big 5, the big companies. The difference is those companies, aside from Huawei, have unfettered access to the U.S., to our capital markets, to our researchers. They hire top researchers. They bring them in and run labs. Alibaba's top quantum research facility outside of China is outside of Bellevue, Washington. They set up a separate quantum research center. They continue to hire graduates and postdocs coming out of those programs. Another aspect of this integration that continues, one of the technologies that really is the foundation of almost every one of those technologies up there is material science. And material science is an area where the United States is no longer actually a leader. It's one of the few areas where in basic science or in innovative breakthrough science, the United States no longer leads. But material science is a foundation for semiconductors, for autos, for nuclear, for AI. You go on down that list. The number of top university programs in material science out in China outnumber the number of top university programs in the United States. In 2017, the Japanese government did a study of leading edge technologies, and they used a series of different proxies, but the one they liked the best was the 1% most highly cited papers. What they discovered was that China was about 32% of all the 1% most highly cited papers in material science in the United States was about 28%. However, it didn't take into account that Chinese nationals and postdocs dominate U.S. material science programs. So the U.S. number is far lower than it appears. Another myth is that Chinese nationals come study here, and that's great for us no matter how many come because they stay. That's not true. Actually, DHS data shows that less than 35%, closer to about 29% of STEM graduate students ever transfer to a visa category that would allow them to become attain permanent status in the United States, which means that 70% of graduate STEM students who come to this country in the PRC return. Ministry of Education data from China says that since 2005, 92% of all Chinese students have returned. Their own data shows they're returning internally, but the myth is that, oh, only like 10% go back. That's not true. It hasn't been true for a very long time. One last sort of little case study before time runs out. Our top material science program in the United States is at Georgia Tech. That Georgia Tech program it's trained probably about 40 or 50 PhD graduate students in the last couple of years. According to the website of the program itself, 8 times as many PRC nationals graduated with PhDs and went back to teach at Chinese universities, to become leaders of Chinese firms, and to run state key labs than the number of Americans who passed through the same program. So the best material science program in the entire nation is producing 8 times as many new professors and lab researchers in the PRC than they are producing in the United States. They produced essentially 2 that stayed on in the U.S. that were U.S. citizens that went on to teach. They produced over 65 PRC PhD graduates from the program who returned to run programs in the PRC. They absolutely must maintain the sort of chimerica integration into our science innovation system. Without the ability to refresh, because as was spoken about earlier by Emily, there is a repressive political system that makes innovation difficult. There is a capricious nature to it. The ability to recycle innovation antibodies from recent graduates and postdocs who run through our system is one of the key elements that enables the PRC to continue to be innovative and enables them to be a fast follower, a peer, or an actual industry leader across the board. And the longer we wait to get after some of these aspects of it, the less likely we are to win this challenge. And not to be hyperbolistic, but if we lose the technology challenge, we lose global leadership. It is that simple. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Emily and Rick, for that excellent commentary. We're going to take questions for about 10 minutes from our audience in person and audience online. So get your questions ready. Before we get there, let me just note that, as Rob stated at the outset, our panel is going to talk about, the innovativeness of Chinese firms. Rob's going to come up afterwards, and then with the next panel, talk about the differences between the U.S. and Chinese innovation and economic systems more broadly, and then also what the United States should do about it. So that'll be the topic for the second half of the panel. And several things y'all both said struck me. One thing you talked about scientific publications, Rick. As I said, I wrote the EVs report. 65% of the high-impact scientific publications in the field of EV and propulsion are now going to Chinese authors. You talked about semiconductors, Emily. Now, while most of this is in the legacy space, China last year installed more new chip-making capacity than the rest of the world combined. So really, across all these industries, the catch-up is rapid. And I should note that if you see this, if you aggregate all 10 industries and 44 companies, we find a mean score of 6. So net, we find that China is about 2 years behind. So just a level set on those points. All right, any questions here from our audience? Please get those ready. Raise your hand as I wait for those. Oh, go ahead, sir. If you would, we're gonna bring a microphone. If you would just be so kind to give us your name and your affiliation, we'd appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Evan DiPetrillo. I'm an AI fellow in Senator Todd Young's office. So Jeff Ding, who's a professor at George Washington, focuses on AI in China, has a new book out, and he's basically arguing that it's not so much innovation in the most critical sectors that is important to national power, but the diffusion of advanced technology throughout the broader economy. What is your take on China's ability to diffuse advanced technologies through the rest of its economy?
I could take this one first. I'm a huge fan of the diffusion deficit concept that Professor Ding has put out. I think the understanding is the Chinese system, if we're looking at the military civil fusion ecosystem, but also the larger research community or base, it's interesting to see, even like through all the sectoral studies, that some of the industries are much more embedded with the academic community. Like one of the examples that I can think of is the robotics report, which, and also there's one really interesting graph, I don't remember on which page of the report, where it talks about how, in fact, China's percentage of researchers that are embedded inside a US, in companies, Chinese companies, are actually comparatively lower than the embedding that's happening in the United States. So I think that could perhaps be a data point of this diffusion deficit, or rather it's suboptimal diffusion, if you will. But I think it's, again, like if you look at the whole forest, you might see this net being 2 years behind. But if you look at specific sectors, I think you will see very different pictures.
I think if you look at software, you're going to get a different answer. I think it's critical to remember this. So when it's sort of software services, the United States has an advantage. There's a whole number of reasons why our capital systems are generated towards that. But if you look at making things, the diffusion of technology, again, the point about China installing more industrial robots than the rest of the world combined, the US being a tiny fraction of that. When you look at hardware, their diffusion of technology is much faster than ours. So when you look at making actual physical things, and there's a reason for that, US firms don't like to invest, and Wall Street and others don't like to put money into sort of the risky patient capital model, right? That we're going to build factories and we're going to make sure that they stick around. Whereas the PRC model purposely drives through a whole number of different levers, long-term investment in productive capacity. And that's a real weakness, because in the end, software is great, software is powerful, but software runs on chips, right? And the investment in legacy chips, while they may not be the high-end chips, the legacy chips make everything in this room work. If you don't control the legacy chips, you lose control of the entire fundamental foundation of technology that makes all the other aspects of the really whiz-bang sort of innovation that we find so enamoring, that this is where Americans have this false sense of security that we're doing so well, we're so far ahead. We're not. We really aren't. And if you run into a world where it's industrial base on industrial base, we're really, really lagging behind, and we're in a very, very bad position, actually.
And if you look at the legacy chips, Chinese are pricing them 30% under the global average. So because these industries are massively subsidized, they're able to compete and subsist in the industries without having to earn market-based return like other companies do. And this, of course, deprives innovative companies across the rest of the world of the revenues they need to reinvest in future generations of innovation. So that's why Chinese innovation mercantilism is broadly so deleterious to innovation industries globally. Oh, good. I'll just go here as I saw your hand come up first, sir.
Hi, my name is Jacob Martin. I'm with International Technology and Trade Associates. One of the most striking things about this chart here is that you note that China is making only modest progress on semiconductors, but they're making rapid progress on AI. With how dependent the AI industry is on semiconductor development, how is China accomplishing this?
I think for two reasons. Well, I mean, if you think, and we have a colleague, Hotan Amar, who's our expert on AI, but I think AI probably consists of three elements, right? The computer processing capacity, the effectiveness of the algorithm, like how smart that code is, and then your access to data. And it's on the latter 2 points that China really excels, right? And access to data, because there's very little, privacy, government controls on data. They can get the data wherever they want. Software, obviously, you don't have to have as much infrastructure in place to educate smart people to write code. But where there's the bottleneck, right, is in that hardware, in the physical chip. And of course, when we have global leaders like NVIDIA making those chips, then I think that's where they're not able to catch up as rapidly because they're not as strong in semiconductors yet. And by Semiconductors Report, interestingly, when you look at sector by sector, where China I found to be strongest was in AI chips with companies like Baren and with design of like Huawei chips from Hisense, whereas they weren't as strong on like the manufacturing tooling side. So, but that'd be my answer. I saw your hand, Sam.
Thanks very much for this. Sam DuPont with Senator Chris Coons. You look at 10 different sectors. I'm just sort of curious. I'm sure there are sort of many answers for each different sector, but curious if you saw any trends as to why China lags in certain sectors, has succeeded in other sectors. Is it specific characteristics of those sectors? Is it U.S. policy? Is it Chinese policy? What accounts for that variance?
If I may, I mean, in some of those areas, what you'll find is where state-owned enterprises dominate. That's where there's less sort of innovation and they're kind of lagging. In the areas where AI is more dominated by that new Big Five I was talking about, right? The equivalent of the U.S. Big Five that drive their innovation as well. And so you have startups and you have those firms funding startups, and you have a more vibrant ecosystem in that regard. And so you see in some of the other, aside from nuclear, and I would note that the AP1000 was a Westinghouse technology, and so that their leap ahead in nuclear is 100% based upon the transfer of technology that DOE fostered through Westinghouse. So that's a unique one where the state enterprises where they're doing well. But in most of the other ones, you're going to find it's sort of legacy state like chemicals and other things. You've got legacy state-owned enterprises. They're not as good and they're not as nimble. And when you have the Big Five, the BATs and the others, pushing ahead, that's where they're most innovative. They're driving incredible amounts of profitability. They're innovative, they're pushing ahead, and they're drawing upon an ecosystem of returnees in ways that state-owned enterprises find difficult to do.
Sam, just one thing in analysis. If you look at EV batteries, Chinese enterprises control the entire value chain, all the way down to the mines, as well as the refining, the production of the cathodes and the anodes. So they have come to dominate that entire global supply chain. But in semiconductors, if you think like the laser alone, an EV machine has 480,000 parts to that laser, you have to rely on a global network of suppliers to have best-in-breed technologies to input. And in sectors like that, I think China's had a more difficult time catching up. Thank you for your questions. I'm going to now turn it over to Rob, who is going to carry on with the presentation and lead us into our second panel. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. If I could ask our two speakers to come up. So we're going to segue now. Look, we could do a whole day just on the Chinese semiconductor industry. So we're covering a lot, but we're going to focus now a little bit on what does this actually mean? What is the Chinese policy system? And most importantly, how should the U.S. respond? I can't think of two better respondents this morning. My colleague, Liza Tobin, who is the Senior Director for Economy at the Special Competitive Studies Project, SCSP. If you haven't been on their website, really need to look at it. Incredibly valuable work across the board there, but in particular, what Liza's been doing. She is the former China director at the National Security Council in the Trump administration, and she led U.S. strategies and policies related to China. Rush Doshi is the senior fellow for Asia Studies and the director of the China Strategy Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations. Most recently, he was the deputy director for China and Taiwan for President Biden's National Security Council. So we're pairing like a Noah's Ark kind of thing here, but we'll.
Actually, Rob, we sat next to each other in the EEOB for about 10 months
Nice.
before I
That's right.
led the Biden
Nice.
administration.
So bipartisanship
Yes.
at the White House.
Yeah.
Exactly. Particularly on this issue. Okay. I turned it off. Fantastic. There we go. All right. So I think, as you've heard before, what I think the most important thing to understand about China, the U.S. economic thinking is really oriented around one thing, and that's allocation efficiency. Don't spend money on stuff the market doesn't need. Don't spend too much. Don't spend too little. If you subsidize the price of wheat, you might get too much wheat and not enough corn. So the entire system is around that, which is why it doesn't say we should have, you don't want to have pick winners or losers or anything like that. The Chinese system is not oriented. They don't care about that. They don't care about losing money. We heard about that new book, Lynn's book. By the way, we interviewed him on our podcast. He makes an important point, but it's not quite the relevant point, which is diffusion of technology is critical to raise productivity. Chinese don't care about productivity either. They really don't. What they care about first and foremost is dominating advanced industries that are global and lead to power. They don't care about productivity. They don't care about wasting money. They're focused really only on, or principally on one main thing, and that's gaining power. And they use words, you can go through all the various sort of sources there. They use martial terms. They use battle. They use dominate. They use win. We don't use martial terms. We use Ricardian terms. If you remember your college economics, trade is a win-win that engaged by both willing parties. Otherwise, it wouldn't be win-win. That's not how China looks at this. So what is the China goal? The China goal, and you can read it in many, many documents, is just to gain the high-level heights of most, if not all, advanced industries. And you have to understand, the share of global advanced industries as a share of GDP has been unchanged in the last 25 years. It's around 12%. Hasn't changed. It won't change. What China wants is they want to keep taking more and more of that market share, and more of that market share means less of our market share. Okay. So if you think about what are the Chinese, what is their system versus what is our system, you have to understand this is, in fact, Xi Jinping once talked about, the quote was essentially, what is really at stake here is which system is better. So this is really a battle of systems. As I said, the Chinese system is based on advanced technology dominance. It seeks national power. Our system is based on allocation efficiency. Their system is based on dynamic and productive efficiency. In other words, new stuff, new industries, new products. We think about advancing technology as we're going to fund more basic science because that's the way we get innovation. They don't think about that. They're funding technology. They're funding applied engineering, applied research. We look at, and Rick mentioned this, we look at things like what's the rate of return? Oh, this is an industry with a high rate of return. It must be good. Again, Chinese don't care about that. They're not looking for rate of return. They're looking for market share. You hear this conversation all the time. The Chinese have an unbalanced economy. They don't get enough consumer spending. If they could just figure that out. They don't want that. Their rate in national investment is twice as high as the US rate of national investment. That is a feature, not a bug. Because for them, they're willing to impoverish the proletariat for many, many decades to come because they think it's going to lead to a better and greater China. Are we willing to impoverish our proletariat for anything? Can we get a gas tax increase of 5 cents a gallon? Yeah, that's not happening. No way. Again, we don't have any real direction in technology, although that's thankfully begun to change a little bit with the Chips and Science Act. And lastly, how do we shape policy? We shape policy by this contention of interests. And Capitol Hill is the way that these all things get worked out. That's not how China works. So if you compare their innovation systems, ours is essentially a very linear system, kind of modeled after that famous scientist Vannevar Bush. We put money into this end, we discover things, then we invent things, we innovate, we get new, then the companies either go offshore or go bankrupt or maybe keep going. If you listen to Lena Khan's comment a while back on why we need to break up big technology companies, her argument was if you destroy the big technology companies, you'll get a lot more little companies. That's that model. The Chinese model is not that. It's copy, and I agree with Rick, it's not all stealing, but a lot of copying. Then they innovate, then they produce, and then they get in this virtuous cycle. They produce, they learn from that, they improve, they keep going. And that is a very, very different system than ours. I won't go into too much detail, but basically, as we look through each of these sectors, we started to identify commonalities that each of them had that looked like you could make it out as a factors of 10 S factors, science and engineering. In the Chinese, science and engineering costs are significantly lower than ours, even relative to China. So they're able to field massive amounts of engineers. So in this case, quality can make up for quality. Head start. If you look at EVs, why are the Chinese ahead on EVs? Because they had a head start, because they forced consumers or incented consumers to buy EVs. We're not doing that. And so most people are like, I'm not going to buy an EV, not yet. Chinese built an industry, so they have a head start. The same thing with drones. Market size, I won't go through that. Speed, subsidies, of course, firm size. What the Chinese antitrust authorities do is they try to find firms that they could smash together and make them bigger. They're like pro-trust over there. So if you look at, for example, their high-speed rail, CRRC, those were two big, giant companies that the Chinese government forced to merge. Space, and I don't mean outer space for that, I mean space to innovate. What's really strange when you think about that is America, we have this view of ourselves that we give our entrepreneurs and our innovators this amazing amount of space. And we actually don't compared to the Chinese. The Chinese, if you want to go and start deploying drones someplace, you go ahead and do it. If you want to start putting EVs on the street, you go ahead and do it. If you want to go into a hospital and walk out with 10 terabytes of data on the same morning and then analyze it, you just go do it. So essentially, our argument is we need to adapt, and I won't go into the detailed specifics, which are in the report, but I think the most important thing is we're really guided in the US by a number of different competing economic doctrines. So sort of one side is sort of global free market capitalism. Another side, maybe on the progressive side, is anti-corporate systems that reject large corporations. But really what we need, I argue, is we need to think about a system of national power capitalism. When the defense committees in the Senate are considering whether to fund a new tank or whether to fund a new airplane, they're not going, I wonder how much money that's going to save us. I wonder what the cost-benefit analysis of that is. No, they're saying if we're going to be powerful, we have to have this weapon system. And I think we're rapidly approaching that point now, or we're already there, where we have to begin to say, we have to have an aerospace industry. We cannot lose Boeing. We just cannot. We have to have a domestic semiconductor industry. We have to have strong biotech, biopharmaceutical firms. And I don't necessarily mean, massive handouts, et cetera, but a recognition that, a recognition that the government has a stake in making sure that we are strong in advanced technologies. And we just can no longer leave it up to individual firms to make those decisions, because those are not always going to be aligned with state interests. And I think now that we're competing with the Chinese in such a vigorous way for global power, and as Rick noted, if we lose this race, we should all think about going to live in the UK, because that's essentially what we'll end up like. We'll just be an interesting former global power that, yeah, nice place to visit, good TV, not very good weather. So we'll have better weather. With that, I'll turn it over to Liza. Over to you. Feel free to use this or there.
Thanks so much, Rob. And I just want to congratulate Rob and Stephen and the rest of the team at ITIF for a really tremendous report. I think it's a huge service to folks on the Hill, to policymakers. Thanks. All right, there we go. Yeah. And to the general public to put out essentially this comparative assessment across a number of key tech sectors and give at least their take on who's ahead, who's behind, and what the pace of change is. These kind of comparative assessments are tremendously difficult. How much qualitative versus quantitative data do you use? Data availability in China is obviously challenging. So I just want to congratulate them on taking a stab at that and doing a really great job and really sounding the alarm. I really like how Rob has smashed a lot of myths. Rick went through a lot of these, and just to kind of summarize, it's clear from what they've written in their report and from everything else that we see that the CCP is not optimizing for profit or productivity or consumer welfare. They're optimizing for power. And so the sooner we absorb that and start making policy decisions accordingly, the better off we'll be. You know, this issue of can China innovate? I dealt with this when I was a China analyst back at the CIA, and around 2015, 2016 or so, we were thinking about this question, and the common understanding was China can't innovate. They just build things, they steal, they copy. But there started to be this creeping sensation that maybe that wasn't right. And as you can see, it's taken, 7, 8, 9, almost 10 years to start to have a change in awareness that, yes, they actually can innovate. And this has massive implications for our prosperity and our national security. So speaking after China experts like Emily, and we're going to have and Rick, and we're going to have Rush soon, I decided I won't focus too much on China. Usually when I talk at things like this, it's all China, China, China. But I think instead I'll focus a little bit on this link between building things and inventing things. So over the last couple decades, of course, the United States has mostly let that link atrophy and disappear, outsourcing, kind of downplaying the importance of production and manufacturing, and this process of learning by doing, where people on the factory floor actually tweak the process and the design as they go along. And so it's this process innovation. And of course, at the same time, China has mastered that link and mastered the art of process innovation. And as Rob has laid out in the report, that doesn't just matter for production, it actually matters for innovation and invention and things on the cutting edge. And if the trends continue as he's laid out, we're going to see them catch up and surpass us in more and more fields. I think production is incredibly relevant in this systemic rivalry that we're in with China. But I want to talk a little bit more about the U.S. And I'm an optimist. As a former policymaker, you have to be a persistent optimist when you're thinking about China. Policy trends and technology trends are, I believe, converging in a new way that wasn't true 3 to 5 years ago. So on the policy side, there's this growing consensus around everything from decarbonization to national resilience after the pandemic, to competition with China, to the needs of the Defense Department. On the technological side, my organization has been digging into the latest tech trends in advanced manufacturing, AI, automation, robotics, U.S. advantage in software-enabled industry and software-enabled manufacturing. There are exciting things happening in this space that were not the case. So think about taking things like ChatGPT and bringing them to the factory floor and enabling much faster, more efficient, more intuitive design and manufacturing. However, to get there, in our process of studying these tech trends, we came across a lot of really exciting startups who are doing things like leveraging AI to create entirely new types of metal that can be used to line fusion reactors, that can be used to make hypersonic missile nose cones, exciting things like this. But in too many cases, they are facing some obstacles to scaling. And so as policymakers and lawmakers thinking about this, I think in order to capture this particularly unique moment that we're in 2024, we need some solutions. And these are everything from scale up financing, making, most of the VC financing goes into software, but to make sure that there's some government public-private partnerships to enable these companies to get money to scale. It's supporting manufacturing process innovation. We have some programs like Manufacturing USA that are small but mighty. They need to be scaled up. Rob has taught me that our programs are tiny compared to the Germanys, the Japans, and the Koreas. And lastly, of course, what always comes up is workforce. So we need to be able to navigate the challenges of a nation of not only educating and training our own workforce, but bringing in high-skilled immigrants from abroad and pairing that with common sense research security practices. So there's a lot more. Happy to talk to you more about our work in this space.
Great. Thank you. Rush.
Well, first, let me just say thanks to everybody for coming. This is a fantastic event and an even more impressive report. I have a lot to say about the report, but let me just start by talking about China. I think that it's important to note, you've heard now from Rob and from Liza, that China is not focused on allocative efficiency, but on power. And I think it's important to understand why. The Chinese Communist Party was formed in the ferment of the Qing dynasty's collapse, in the century of humiliation. And the basic animating theory for them moving forward was they needed to achieve fuqiang, wealth and power. And that has been the phrase, not just for Chinese nationalists, other nationalists in Japan and Vietnam too, but especially in China, that's been driving their pursuit of economic and technology dominance for a long time. And you don't need to take my word for it. You can read the text. Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, they all talked about this stuff. What are the four industrial revolutions? It's an interesting concept where people talk about we're in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution. In 2017, Xi Jinping gave a speech about these four industrial revolutions, borrowing from a Davos concept. He said the very first one was essentially steam power. And the US, actually Great Britain, was able to kind of jump on that train and be able to ride that to global supremacy. The second industrial revolution was electrification. And the United States rode that all the way to global dominance, and it sustained that dominance with the third industrial revolution, which is mass manufacturing. And what Xi Jinping said is that we're in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution. This is also a concept from Davos, as I mentioned. But this fourth industrial revolution is not just a chance to get rich, it's a chance to get powerful. And the geopolitical lens in which they look at technology and capacity cannot be dismissed. In fact, they don't dismiss it. You've seen in this report several references to it. You heard it from Rob and Liza and others, and you're hearing it again from me. So that is how they look at this, and that is not how we look at this, and that's a critical distinction. Second point, the conversation on these issues, thanks to this report and other reports, is changing. I think for a long time, we heard about a number of myths that people continue to believe about China's capabilities. Those myths, in many cases, are wrong. What I think is most interesting is in just the last few weeks, we saw a series of reports come out that help us better understand just how competitive China is. One is this report. Another is Marco Rubio's report on the Chinese industrial challenge. Mario Draghi in the European Union just wrote about how the Chinese industrial ecosystem poses an existential threat to European prosperity. And of course, The Economist a few weeks ago, or months ago now, had this extensive deep dive into innovation and basic science research capability in China, and on net, how that was exceeding some of the capabilities in the United States. So all of that suggests the conversation is now changing, which leads to a third point. That is a prerequisite to changing policy. You have to have your assessment of the situation change before policy can change. We are now witnessing a change in assessment. But I want to dwell on this point for a moment, because I think a lot of people say, look, China's growth is slowing. Their demography, it's bad. They're peaking. But they're not really paying attention to, I think, what's happening under the hood. Yes, all those things are true. Yes, China has challenges, but it's also the case that in industry after industry, they're gaining global market share. And that's not just in fast follow. We're talking about introducing world-leading products as well, as the report here notes. So that's why I want to focus on assessment, because it's easy to see right now a debate. Well, maybe we don't have to worry too much. They'll just slow down naturally. Versus, wow, they're 10 feet tall, and maybe they're just 8 feet tall, but they're still quite tall, and that's a problem for the United States. I think the next area of assessment I want to just briefly mention is, let me just tell you what it looks like to get the assessment wrong. There's a great book by my former professor, Aaron Friedberg, called The Wary Titan. It's about the experience of relative decline in the United Kingdom from 1895 to 1905. The second chapter is one of my favorites because it talks a lot about how they were discussing in Great Britain at the time just why they were losing competitiveness to the United States and Germany. And they were concerned about how they were going to get the initiative again. And instead of really rallying around a set of solutions to recapitalize their industry and increase their competitiveness, they essentially disagree about the assessment of what's happening, and nothing really happens when it needs to happen. And Great Britain goes into World War I essentially already a deindustrializing power. And in World War II, entirely dependent on the United States to sustain itself. And of course, today, a financial power to be sure, but not a manufacturing power. There's no reason why it couldn't still be a manufacturing power other than it made a different set of choices. And I think, as Rob notes, we don't want to be in that situation. The end game for the United States, if we don't get our act together, is that we would end up a deindustrialized power specializing in commodities, tax evasion, real estate, and tourism rather than industry. And that is not in America, I think anybody here wants, but that is where the trend lines are going if you look at our export profile. We look more like Brazil increasingly than we do like the US of the 1990s or the 1980s. That's not a great situation, which leads me to policy. So we have assessments that are beginning to change. We have reports like this one that are helping policymakers understand the problem. What do we need to do? And I was a policymaker for 3 years at the National Security Council as director and then deputy senior director for China and Taiwan affairs. We thought a lot about this. We worked on stuff like the Chips and Science Act. We worked on other industrial policy initiatives. Let me just say a few things. It's not just Chinese theft that we have to worry about. It's also the fact that many of these companies are incredibly competitive. They are successful. Sure, they're subsidized in many cases, but they also are able to benefit from scale. They are real performers, and we can't take that for granted. I think second, I would just note that the United States as an ecosystem that many countries would envy and want to access, and access to that ecosystem is a privilege, not a right, and we should be able to curtail access when it is not in our interest to provide it. And we should also beneficially offer that access to allies and partners who share our interests and values. I think in addition, I would note that their state has a role in helping the U.S. remain a competitive industrial power. This is not just a question that can be left to the markets. It's not just a question that can be left to companies. That's why Congress has taken action increasingly in a bipartisan fashion here, but we need more. And I think what you're seeing in the report from Rob and what you heard in the comments from Liza is that the kind of solutions we need aren't just tinkering around the edges, a few incentive programs here, or maybe a few tax credits there. They're structural changes that fundamentally alter the way in which we are able to compete. And they're not that dissimilar from the kinds of things this country has done in the past, and with a fair amount of political will could do again today. This isn't a hard thing for us to do. We have a lot of advantages. We just don't have the political will. And that's why I'm glad we're here on Capitol Hill today, because I think this is the branch of government more than the executive branch that matters in creating that capacity. And I could say that having worked in the executive, doing the best I could. But I think ultimately the solutions will come in a bipartisan fashion from Congress. Let me just end by, again, a note of optimism. In industry after industry, you're seeing the Chinese sort of catch up, sometimes surpass the United States. But this is a dynamic situation, a dynamic playing field. This is a fourth industrial revolution. And there are opportunities for the United States to achieve leapfrog again over China. And you see that in batteries right now, with the question of whether or not solid state batteries might be superior battery technology, and maybe we have a lead there. So we shouldn't, necessarily be pessimistic. We should be alarmed. We should be acting with a sense of urgency and bipartisanship. We should also focus on the fact that there are opportunities ahead of us should we configure our political and economic system to take advantage of them. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Rush. Congressman Molnar is almost here, who's head of the China Select Committee, and he's going to make some remarks. So we're kind of talk for a moment, and then as soon as he comes, obviously, I'll introduce him. Rush, you mentioned this is part of our legacy. And in fact, this report came out under the ITIF Hamilton Institute for Industrial Competitiveness. There's a great letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1816, where everybody who thinks, Jeffersonian ag, we're going to be an ag economy and all that stuff. And Jefferson said, yeah, I used to think that until we almost lost the War of 1812. And I realized if we had lost that war, everything would have been different. And the only way we can prevent that from happening is we have to have manufacturing. We have to have power. And that really was the U.S. approach until the 70s. Both parties, long legacy of national developmentalism. We were trying to beat the Soviets. Why did we invest more in the 1950s than in R&D, federal government, than every other country combined, business and government? Every other business in the world, every other government in the world, U.S. government spent more on R&D in the early 1960s. I do want to ask both of you a question, which is, again, we may have to stop, but Rush, you mentioned that things are changing, and that it's like you can't really make progress in policy until you come up with a framework that is related to what you want to do. Why has it taken as long as it has? And for both of you, why has it taken as long as it has, and what are the major barriers to keeping it, not having it go even faster?
Well, it's a great question. I think the first one is that perceptions change slowly. And so that we have this sticky sense in our minds of what China is capable of. And it's difficult to update that perception absent a major shock. You noted 1812 was a shock for Jefferson. We haven't had that 1812 moment, but it could come. And it would come probably too late for us to change the trend line. So my point would be that reports like this chip away at that perception, and they help people better appreciate the nature of change in this situation where China is far more competitive than people recognize. The second reason why this is difficult is politics. I mean, there are a number of industries, a number of sectors that have a different view of how the U.S. economy should work and what it should focus on. Maybe they're more focused on allocative efficiency than they are on production and developmentalism and capacity. And so what ultimately is going to be needed is political leadership that helps push back on certain vested interests and says essentially there is a better path forward for our prosperity and our national power. We're going to have to embark on that path together, given the trend lines.
Money. I think consumers have gotten.
My bad. Sorry. There you go.
Sorry. There we go. Money. I think there've been a lot of kind of this sense that we were all taught from liberal economics about gains through trade. The pie gets bigger if we just open everything in this global fashion to free trade. Prices go down for everyone. And I think we've enjoyed the deflationary effects of China entering the global economy, especially since 2001. Wall Street has enjoyed access to the capital markets in China. I think what Rob's report does is focus on the future economic effects of China catching up in innovation, and that those risks may not be measurable in annual GDP growth, in inflation, in consumer prices, but we need to think bigger than that. We need to come up with this new economic paradigm that values things like national security, national resilience, jobs, having a manufacturing base that can produce what we need when we need it, whether we're going to war or entering a pandemic or just day-to-day producing what we need.
Yeah, question. Yeah, please wait.
I feel like each of you sort of outlined some parameters of policy ideas. Rush, you did that sort of explicitly, but Liza, you were also talking about we need to focus on capital access and workforce. And I guess I'd be interested in hearing maybe from each of you one big policy idea that you have that you think could help address some of these challenges. Maybe later.
We'll do it later. No, you can stay, but we'll just stay. We may have a few minutes left. One answer is there's a bill in the Senate to create an industrial development bank somewhere.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Don't say that in the
microphone. So we're really pleased and honored that Congressman Molinar is here with us. He is the chairman of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with China. So could not imagine a better and more appropriate person to cap off the conversation that we've just been having this morning. He represents Michigan's 2nd District, and he brings years of leadership experience in both the public and private sector to Congress. So, Congressman, thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much. And Robert, thank you and your team for the effort that went into this report and for the invitation to speak today. For the past few years, 2 years, I've served on the Select Committee, and since April have been the chairman. And for decades, I, along with many Americans, believe that an unbridled economic engagement with the Chinese Communist Party would lead to democracy in China and prosperity at home. and that, as we know, has not come to pass. And from the militarization of the South China Sea to unabashed economic coercion and market manipulation, flooding our communities with fentanyl, the Chinese Communist Party has shown its true colors. And the CCP has taken technological tools that we've given them to forge new surveillance chains to hold the Chinese people in bondage. And they've tried to extend these chains around the world, including to America itself. Lenin once observed, capitalists will sell us the very rope that we will use to hang them. The CCP has taken Lenin's view to heart. Like good Marxists, they see economics as an extension of politics, one in which they win by eliminating the competition. Joint ventures and investment are tools for Chinese firms to eliminate, not cooperate with American firms. I want to illustrate the stakes before us by telling the story of two companies. Both produce electric batteries. Both built factories in my home state of Michigan. The first was named A123, and it no longer exists. It had a unique technology, one with the potential to revolutionize the global electric battery industry. And it did, but not in the hands of A123. That battery technology, once owned by A123 and developed by Americans at the University of Texas and MIT, now belongs to a firm, a Chinese firm named CATL. With it, CATL controls about 37% of the global market for electric batteries. You see, in 2009, A123 Systems made a mistake. It was a mistake hundreds of companies have made in the past 5 decades. The company set up a joint venture with Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, a state-owned auto producer in China. The company had access to cheap labor, knew the Chinese domestic market, and was directly supported by CCP officials who could handle any regulatory hurdles that A123 might face. The problem was SAIC was really after A123's technology. Once it had access to that, the Chinese company then flooded the market with state-subsidized battery that used A123's own technology. Unable to compete, A123 found itself facing bankruptcy and was acquired by SAIC's holding company, despite CFIUS concerns. SAIC closed A123's U.S. operations, laid off the workforce, and relocated operations in China, where Chinese firm CATL now seeks to dominate the world's supply chains with this very same technology. Now CATL is returning to the scene of the crime, building a new factory in Michigan, subsidized by American tax dollars, and using American technology to deepen our dependence on supply chains controlled by Beijing. These tactics are unethical, they're wrong, they're dangerous. Worst of all, though, as today's report notes, these tactics are successful. Let me read out a few numbers from today's report. In 2023, China installed more industrial robots and had more nuclear power plants under construction than the rest of the world combined. China also accounted for 62% of global EV production. A majority of the world's new chip-making capacity in 2024 will be constructed in China. And from 2017 to 2021, the rate of new clinical drug trials in China grew faster than any other nation. These statistics should raise alarm bells in capitals around the world. The CCP's track record shows that any dependencies or open doors can be and will be weaponized by the party at a time and place of its choosing. This isn't speculation. This is a playbook we have seen far too many times to count. That playbook reflects the difference in values between ourselves and the CCP. For Americans, economic growth and innovation are pathways to improve the well-being of all parties. For the CCP, economic growth and innovation are about increasing the power of the party, both at home and abroad. Chinese entrepreneurs are supported, their companies subsidized, and their foreign competitors are targeted for IP theft and economic warfare. Entrepreneurs such as Jack Ma and foreign firms may have roles as temporary tools, but at the end of the day, they have no place in the house Xi Jinping is building. The CCP only wins if they and we lose. Our competition, like that with the Soviet Union, is not between two countries, but between two visions of the future. The only way of life, the only way our way of life survives is if we win and they lose. Our committee has been shouting this warning from the very rooftops. The Select Committee has traveled to Boston, New York, Silicon Valley with a simple message. We cannot continue to fund our own destruction. We cannot provide our greatest adversary with the tools needed to kill our men and women in uniform. We cannot continue supplying the technology that will be used to drive our companies out of business and leave our citizens out on the street. In 2023 alone, Wall Street channeled $5.7 billion of American investment to 61 PRC companies that the US government has blacklisted because they advance the PRC's military capabilities or support its human rights abuses. The companies receiving these funds develop advanced fighter jets and nuclear weapons for the People's Liberation Army and create the technology used to perpetrate the ongoing genocide against the Uyghur people. I'm proud of the work our committee's done in highlighting these troubling investments, as well as those in cutting-edge technologies such as artificial intelligence. We've made a real difference in the way the financial community talks about China and perceives the risk investing there. The Biosecure Act, which passed the House last week, directly challenges the dependence of much of America's biopharmaceutical community on companies like WuXi AppTec, WuXi Biologics, and BGI. It will ensure that over the next 8 years, we liberate our medical supply chains from CCP control without disrupting the existing markets. These pieces of legislation are, I hope, just the start. Last December, our committee produced a list of 150 bipartisan recommendations to rebalance our country's economic relationship with the PRC. If you know anything about Washington, you will know how rare that sort of bipartisanship is. Outbound capital and export controls are critical to our defensive strategy and buying the time needed to rebuild our industrial base at home. De minimis reform will allow U.S. manufacturers to compete on an even playing field. By holding PRC firms accountable for the use of slave labor, we take a stand in defense of our values and eliminate an unfair and immoral advantage. By protecting our companies and universities from IP theft, we defend American ingenuity and inherent advantages of a free system that encourages creativity and innovation over a totalitarian ideology that rewards blind obedience. But like my Detroit Lions, we must play both offense and defense. Research security and IP defense matter little if we are not researching new technologies or developing IPs to defend. For centuries, America has been the promised land for the best and brightest across the world who wanted to explore the frontiers of human knowledge or create companies without red tape. We must continue to be that promised land. And that means ensuring entrepreneurs are free to innovate, universities are free from foreign influence, and students are free to speak their minds. Export and outbound capital restrictions are a necessary condition for our victory over the CCP. And by combining these types of tools with investments in our own innovation, we can achieve victory. I want to thank you again for having me, and it's wonderful to be with you today. Hope you have a great day.
Congressman, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and those very wise words, and thank you for your leadership on the committee. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I do want to kind of end with maybe we're here, and so the $64,000 question is, okay, what do we do? So I have an idea, but I think, as the Congressman said, there's like 128 or so. There's really no end of ideas. There really isn't. I mean, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of things that we have to do. But I'm going to put you both on the spot and say, pick one or pick two, be on the top of your wish list if you were czar. Liza.
Sure. So there are emerging or well-developed policy efforts on a couple of the key technologies. IRA, EV batteries is one, chips, semiconductors is obviously another. But we need one that runs across all of these. So the enabling technologies that we need to get back in the game in production and manufacturing are this suite of advanced manufacturing technologies that are offering this opportunity as AI revolutionizes how companies make things. So SCSP has proposed a overarching national approach to advanced manufacturing with a number of lines of effort. And so I won't go into all of them there, but we have proposed, this suite of proposals, everything from scale-up financing, and Rob mentioned one of the efforts that's in draft legislation for an industrial finance corporation, so something to help companies scale up. We need better cyber protection tools. Manufacturing experiences more cyber threats than any other sector. We need workforce efforts. We need trade policies that help insulate us from China's brute force economics. In any case, we've laid this out in the report, and we really need this so that we have the production base necessary to build and succeed in all the technologies that are in this report.
Great, thank you. Rush.
That's a great list. And I think I'll just make 2 points. And it goes back to what I said earlier, which is that I think what's necessary is thinking in structural terms about our policy prescriptions, not just piecemeal, but structural. The first structural proposal is one that's in this report, one, Rob, that you mentioned. It's sort of an industrial development bank, something that is critically needed, I think, in the United States, although perhaps a little controversial. But the reason it is needed is because if you look at the financial sector today, they can get great returns in software, but they're not so sure about hardware manufacturing. They're not going to be able to fill that gap. They're not patient enough. And you look at the trends in venture capital, it's all in that software direction until very recently, where there's now more zeitgeist around hardware, but we'll see if it translates into returns. So you need an industrial development bank to create structural conditions for firms to invest in the kinds of capabilities that we know we need, and that financial markets don't always reward. The second structural proposal that I would put forward is a combination of something Congress can do and allies and partners need to do. The congressional element is to take my very favorite executive order, which is the ICTS executive order that the Trump administration put in place, but that the Biden administration used, most recently on the question of EVs and their connection to networks. I'd like to see that have some statutory basis so it's protected from litigation. And then I'd like to see it used as a way of creating barriers to dumping and excess capacity in the U.S. market. A lot of things have access, connect to networks, and it's pretty straightforward to be able to use that authority to prevent dumping, but also to ensure national security simultaneously. And the reason this connects to allies and partners is it's going to be really hard to get totally aligned with allies and partners on a trade agenda, no matter what happens in the presidential election or in Congress. But it's much easier to get aligned on a regulatory agenda. And regulatory harmonization that puts up these kinds of barriers might make sense for all of us, because the alternative is that we lose our industries. So those are two structural proposals that I think would find bipartisan support, I would hope, and would actually make a significant difference in the competition. Thanks.
Well, I'll take the moderator's privilege by agreeing with that. And one of the things that we tend to overlook in this is competition in advanced industries is really, a lot of it is around market share, is the size, because these industries have what economists call high fixed costs, low marginal costs. Building the first piece of software, building the first plane, building the first chip cost an enormous amount of money. The last one you sell, relatively cheap compared to that. So that's why market access for us and limiting theirs. So 100% agree that we need to be working closely with our allies and limiting their market access to us. Stephen just wrote a report on Monday on displays. Chinese now dominate the LTE market, and they're close to getting dominance in the OLED market. And that has been through IP theft, but more importantly, massive subsidies. The CHIPS Act will fund chips, fabs here, and probably, including with the tax credit, maybe 30 to 35% total CapEx subsidy. In China, the CapEx subsidy for these OLED factories is 90%. How are you supposed to compete with that? Well, the way you compete with it is you basically say, hey, Hisense. I went to Best Buy the other day because our refrigerator kicked the bucket. And so I looked at the Chinese TVs, which, by the way, you don't know they're Chinese because they don't, not a big red symbol on it. A lot of Chinese TVs at Best Buy. So that's number one. Number two, sort of very simple. Our tax reform, or tax is coming up again next year because of the expiration. Two things that, one, we should just continue to put back in place first-year expensing. Companies tend to want to be capital light. This is an easy way to get more investment if they can write it off in the first year. And then related to that is the R&D credit. We did an analysis of R&D tax generosity around the world and ranked about 34 countries. The Chinese R&D credit is about 3.7 times more generous than ours. We rank 32nd out of 34 nations in R&D tax credit generosity. Back in 1994, we were #1. So we should double the R&D credit, not super expensive. And then my last one, which is a little bit of a little bit of an Overton window one. I was just in Taipei for a week, and I've long been a fan of what they have there called ITRI, the Industrial Technology Research Institute. ITRI is where TSMC came out of. Morris Chang worked there. I'm not saying Morris Chang's not an incredible entrepreneur, but the core technology really came out of ITRI. It's a national lab, but our national labs are focused on photons and photon torpedoes, I think, right? Their national labs are focused on industrial competitiveness. And I think we should create one. I think that would be a fantastic thing to do. By the way, interesting historical thing. Anybody want to guess where ITRI was originally, how it was originally created and who funded it? AID. We created it because we wanted Taiwan to be strong. So we created it. So it's good enough for them, should be good enough for us.
欢迎来到6度解析，新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的6度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，6度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是6度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的6度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切 尽在6度解析，立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。